Hey everyone, I'm back for another edition of True Crime AHS. Today we're diving into the real-life horror that inspired Roanoke. Before we jump in, make sure you're subscribed to the channel for all your AHS needs. That includes more true crime, the latest on the upcoming season of AHS Double Feature, and of course, a ton of breakdowns from past seasons of the show. Since we're focusing on Roanoke this week, there's no better place to start than with the Lost Colony of Roanoke. Before we watched a minute of the 6th season, we were already given a crash course of the Roanoke story from Billie Dean Howard back in Murder House. As she explains it, all 117 settlers of the Roanoke colony in North Carolina died by unknown causes. They became known as the Ghost Colony because of course their spirits remained on the land and haunted the native tribes in the area. The only way to stop these spirits was to banish them for good. The natives collected all their personal belongings, set them on fire, and a shaman uttered one single word. Croatoan. That same word was found carved on a post at the abandoned colony. But that's not the full story. See, there were some inconsistencies with Billie's story, which is honestly not surprising due to how the legend grew over the centuries. A very, very long game of telephone. Now, a much scarier story was revealed during the reenactments of My Roanoke Nightmare. In the late 1500s, Governor John White set up an English settlement on the North Carolina coast but had to seek out more supplies. He left his wife Thomasin in charge of the colony, which upset some of the others. That's an understatement. The insurgency was led by Mr. Cage, and it also included her own son, Ambrose. The settlers put her in a scold's bridle and banished her from the colony, leaving her to starve to death in the forest. Lucky for her, someone or something was looking out for her. Scathach, a witch with powers bestowed on her from the ancient, bloodthirsty gods, offered to save Thomasin in exchange for her soul and undying loyalty. It sounded like a good deal to Thomasin at the time, who was so excited she ate the heart of a boar right then and there. Thus began Thomasin's revenge tour. Mr. Cage, he was a goner, but surprisingly she spared her son. What a nice mom. Thomasin took over control of the colony and relocated them 100 miles inland, and it would get even darker. At her witch's recommendation, Thomasin would often sacrifice the colonists, including the poor, innocent children. Ambrose again wasn't a fan of it and decided to leave the colony and return to England. Thomasin pretended to have realized her faults and vowed to return to her Christian ideals, but she was lying. She kills everyone in the name of her bloodthirsty gods, forever tethering their spirits to the land. Now, centuries later, the Lost Colony of Roanoke still haunts the land, and every year, to honor their gods, they sacrifice a new soul during the blood moon. So basically, if you're looking for a new home in the North Carolina countryside, stay as far away from the Big Shaker Mansion as humanly possible. Clearly, the AHS writers took some liberties when it came to their version of the Lost Colony. The real story doesn't include any witches or ghosts, but it's nonetheless a truly bizarre mystery. Following the failure of an early settlement on Roanoke Island, John White led an attempt in 1587 on the same island. This would become known as the Lost Colony. It turns out that White and his men weren't even supposed to be there. They had orders to establish a colony in Chesapeake Bay, but they stopped in North Carolina to check in on another settlement. When they arrived, they found everything had been abandoned and their ship captain refused to let anyone back aboard except for Governor White. It was late in the year, resources were scarce, and the relationship with the natives grew more hostile. White returned to England for more resources and supplies, but the Anglo-Spanish War delayed his voyage back to America. When he returned 4 years later, he found the entire Roanoke colony in ruins and not one of the 112 plus settlers, including his own granddaughter Virginia Dare, who was the first English child born in an English colony in America. And just as we saw in American Horror Story, the word Croatoan was carved into a post in the fort. White initially believed that meant the colony had relocated to Croatoan Island, but he was unable to confirm this due to the rough Atlantic seas. Unfortunately, White was once again forced to return to England. Years later, stories grew about the fate of the Lost Colony. Some believe they had been massacred by the hostile native tribes, others that they assimilated with natives down the coast, and a few even believe that supernatural powers were at play. To this day, even with advancements in technology and archaeological research, historians are unable to say how this colony was lost in America's history. We know that John White was a real person, but what about Thomasin White, aka the Butcher? Well, according to history books, White was married to a woman named Thomasin, but that's pretty much where her story ends. No, she did not get banished from an English colony in America. No, she did not eat a beating heart of a boar, and no, she did not sacrifice young children. In fact, there's no evidence that Thomasin even joined the American expedition. Sure, heightened fears of witchcraft were brewing during this time period, which probably led writers down this path. And what about that BFF she makes that lonely night in the woods? Sorry, Scathach isn't real, but her name comes from Celtic mythology. She's an Irish warrior woman, and it translates to Shadowy One. The writers went even deeper into Irish lore when we hear the butcher recite lines from an old Irish song called The Song of Emergence and repeated the words again in English.
I am the queen of every hive. I am the fire on every hill. I am the shield over every head.
It turns out the lack of background and knowledge of Thomasin White left an awful lot of room for speculation in the AHS writer's room, and boy did they turn her into one of the most terrifying characters we've ever seen on the series. Let's move on to Miranda and Bridget Jane, the murderous nurses that would call the Big Shaker Mansion home during the 1980s. After stumbling upon some home videos at the house, Matt and Shelby learn about the sisters' story. Back in 1988, the pair worked in an assisted living home in New York, but during their time there, multiple patients died of mysterious unknown causes. The Jain sisters were singled out as prime suspects in the case, but skipped town before authorities could catch them. So what did they do next? Well, they opened up their own small business in murder, of course. They moved into the Big Shaker Mansion and seeked out families that are in need of elderly care. They were also very specific on who they selected because they wanted the first letters of their patients' names to spell out one of their favorite words. Here's a hint, it's not love. Unbeknownst to the families that needed care for their elderly relatives, the nurses planned a twisted game of torture and murder.
E is for Eunice.
Finally, some cops showed up to investigate the care facility, probably because clients were missing members of their families, and unsurprisingly, the sisters had vanished yet again. All they found were the gruesome remains of their patients and the nurse's favorite word unfinished on the wall. Were they big fans of The Shining? We'll never know. As horrible as the Jain sisters were, they still feared the spirits that roamed the house, but they did not want to leave. Not smart, ladies. If the butcher tells you to go, you go. Instead, they resisted, and the two were taken outside and brutally murdered by the spirits of the Lost Colony.
Thou shalt not want for lack of company.
The spirits of the Jain sisters would forever be linked to the soil and would continue to terrorize and kill for decades. Oh, and yes, they finally got to finish their favorite word, murder. In Return to Roanoke, 3 Days in Hell, poor Rory Monahan became the nurse's latest victim, allowing them to complete their game. The Jain sisters were in fact inspired by nurses Catherine May Wood and Gwendolyn Gale Graham, also known as the Lethal Lovers. No, they weren't sisters. The pair worked together at a nursing home in Walker, Michigan from 1985 to 1988. And just like the Jain sisters, there were a handful of suspicious deaths at the facility. In this case, Wood and Graham were arrested and arraigned for the murder of 2 of those patients. What makes this story even wilder, apparently there was a theory that the pair were making a game out of the murders. According to Graham, they would choose victims by their initials to spell out the word murder. Ultimately, that was a bit too difficult to pull off, so they just started killing random people. Everyone keep in mind though that the New York Times couldn't confirm the validity of this theory. After their arrest, they actually turned on one another, claiming that the other one had done all the dirty work. Wood testified that she served as a lookout for Graham, who murdered the patients by smothering them with a washcloth. In the end, Graham was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder, earning 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Wood, on the other hand, was charged with second-degree murder and a 40-year sentence. A parole board refused to release Wood for 8 straight attempts. That's until October 2019 when she was finally granted parole. After fighting an appeal, Wood became a free woman on January 21st, 2020 and moved to Fort Mill, South Carolina. Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed another episode of True Crime. Let us know about other TV shows and movies that we should explore in the future. Thanks again for watching, and I'll be back next week.
We are going to be filming everything. People want the reality. They're interested in the process.